Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep, the channel where curiosity meets chronic drowsiness. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams, a place where the royal robes never flapped dramatically and no trumpet ever dared blast above a hum. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves. This is history at its yawn-worthy finest. Let us drift now to a small and soggy corner of the world, Belgium. Yes, Belgium. A kingdom famous for its medieval tapestries, spectacularly neutral politics, and its cheeses that try not to offend anyone at all. And nestled between its chocolate box cities and rain-patted cobblestone streets, stood a gentleman so delightfully unnoticeable. You could walk past him 400 times in a palace hallway and never be quite sure if he was furniture. King Leopold II gets the scandal documentaries, so we will not speak of him tonight. No. Our snore-worthy sovereign of choice is his successor, King Albert III's eldest son, the one who came after the wars, after the turmoil, and very nearly after the point entirely. His name was King Baudouin. Baudouin. Even his name sounds like someone botched the spelling of boring while half asleep. Born in 1930, our strangely spellbindingly dull monarch grew up under the polite weight of royal expectations. His breakfast was punctual, his socks mathematically paired, and his rebellions, if any, were conducted via slightly off-center neckties. He was serious, very serious, so serious in fact that when he smiled, and this is historical record, diplomats often needed a moment to process what had happened. Was it indigestion? A royal tic? Did someone misplace the Belgian constitution? But Baudouin was not just boring. Oh no, that would be too exciting. He was respectfully, legally, constitutionally boring. Every one of his public addresses seemed arranged by a committee of sleepy owls. He would read from notes in the tone of someone checking inventory at a used typewriter fair. And yet, somehow, the people liked him, or at least did not like him, which, for a monarchy recovering from world wars, abdications, and the occasional fraternal family squabble, was oddly comforting. Rain, as you might guess, played an important role in Baudouin's oeuvre. It was a frequent co-star in his daily life. Something about the Belgian skies seemed to match his disposition. Each morning, the king would look out over Brussels and see exactly what he saw every other day. A city mildly glistening from yet another grey drizzle. Never a dramatic thunderstorm, but instead just the kind of persistent wetness that made even the iron fences seem tired. On the days he wasn't waving solemnly from balconies, in a motion so slow it was like watching paint gesture politely, Baudouin busied himself with grand affairs of state, reading documents, listening to ministers describe budgets, and avoiding anything resembling emotion on camera. His job, after all, was not to thrill. It was to not cause concern. And he did that marvelously well for 4 decades. In 1951, when he first became king, newspapers politely nodded. They described him as earnest, modest, and responsible, which are words journalists use when there is absolutely nothing to put on the front page, and they've already run an article on ecclesiastical shoelaces. And if you're wondering if anything outlandish ever happened, like a joust, a court scandal, or an accidental declaration of war over a bakery mix-up, let me reassure you, not even once. His life, much like warm vanilla pudding in a palace bowl, stayed exactly where it was placed. He did marry, of course, eventually. Queen Fabiola was her name, a Spanish noblewoman known for charitable work, perfectly balanced hats, and looking like someone who had, quite literally, walked out of a Protestant fairy tale dressed for Sunday tea. Their courtship was cautious and conservative, blessed by the public as rather charming, and by the royal gardeners as very convenient, timing-wise. The wedding was televised, of course, and viewers described it with glowing terms such as tidy, adequate, and weather-appropriate. The sort of event where no one faints, nothing breaks, and even the doves fly in pre-rehearsed formation. But Baudouin was not without his mysteries. There was a certain opaque depth to his stillness, a kind of determined quiet that made his tedium feel almost sacred, like a library's hush after hours. Perhaps he knew something about reigning that the flashier monarchs forgot, that sometimes ruling a nation means not setting fire to anything. It means showing up, listening intently, and maintaining eye contact with bureaucratic paperwork until it folds in surrender. Tonight, the rain taps gently against the ink-blotted ledgers of our minds, and somewhere in the grand beige silence of Belgian history, King Baudouin takes his seat again, in a chair so symmetrical it could lull a squirrel to sleep. And in our next dreamy glide through this royal drizzle, we shall peek behind the curtains of his vanilla-flavoured court, where foreign dignitaries yawn discreetly and protocols unfold like well-starched napkins. But not just yet. Let that wait, while we float a little further into the fog. Picture this: a crisp, drizzly morning in 1472, somewhere between a drizzle and a sigh, the kind of weather that makes soup jealous and windows foggy. In a modest, overly symmetrical castle in a region no invading army ever bothered to memorize, reigned King Egbert the exceptionally mild, a man whose idea of adventure was ordering toast without jam. Now, let us clarify something rather important about King Egbert. He was not a bad king. No tyrannical moustache, no dungeon hobbies, no sudden declarations of unpopular crusades. He was simply, comfortably, irrevocably dull. If interesting monarchs are fireworks in our history's sky, Egbert was the warm bath after, and quite proud of it. At the age of 42, Egbert had governed the kingdom of Greyleaf for 2 remarkably uneventful decades. His subjects respected him exactly the way one might respect a mailbox, always there, unmoving, and generally rectangular. There were no uprisings, no revolts, no scandal, and not once did he misplace the crown, which was kept neatly beside the teapot in his favourite cupboard. But for 1972 would bring a challenge unlike any other, a turbulent affair whispered across the cobbled paths of the Royal Herb Garden, the annual Kingdom Festival. Now, you may wonder, what sort of festival could exist in a kingdom this low on horsepower? A jousting tournament, a masque, a dramatic retelling of the Siege of Blague-on-Tweed? Not exactly. The highlight of the festival was the Great Royal Yawn-Off, a tradition as old and aimless as the kingdom itself. Citizens from the many thoroughly average corners of Greyleaf would gather to witness the king perform his famous Yawn of State, a meticulously choreographed yawn performed before a crowd, with velvet pajamas and a ceremonial blanket. It wasn't just any yawn, of course. It had a long and snoring lineage. According to old records, the tradition began with Egbert's great-great-grandfather, King Mumble the peacefully unambitious, who once fell asleep mid-decree and was applauded by Parliament for encouraging the economy of speech. Since then, royal yawns had become symbolic, a sign of national stability, of profound, immovable beige. Egbert had never missed a yawn-off, but this year things were different. He had a cold, a sniffly, inconvenient royal cold. Now, most illnesses in the medieval court were described with colourful, sometimes alarmingly poetic names. The ague of Elsbeth, the bloating of Sir Peter, the wincing twitch of Weatherford. But Egbert had a humble head cold, the kind that makes your nose sound like a stuffed sock and transforms every attempted decree into a soggy limerick. Yet it posed a grave problem. The royal yawn was a delicate art, too vigorous, and one risked a sneeze, too timid, and the people might think the monarchy had lost its passion for nap-based symbolism. It was a constitutional crisis, at least on parchment. The royal court rallied. "Perhaps your majesty could hire a yawn double," suggested Sir Chadwick, the royal nap coordinator. He paused, then frowned. "No, that might lead to yawn fraud." "Rub onions on your nostrils," offered Dame Mildred, the castle's official mystic of flat-footed ailments. "Worked wonders for my cousin Wallace after he sneezed during a chess match in '69. "Let's cancel," whispered Sir Gilbert, the treasurer. "Just say it's raining. It's always raining." But King Egbert was not one to disrupt tradition. He believed in peaceful continuity, warm milk, and the integrity of well-timed vocal stretches. So, wrapped in 17 layers of wool, with a handkerchief embroidered with the royal crest, 2 spoons napping beneath a cloud, he ventured forth to the sleepy applause of his kingdom. There, in front of the great crowd, roughly 37 people and 1 goose, King Egbert yawned, gently, carefully, a vision of subdued concentration. One eyebrow lifted with thrilling regularity. A single tear rolled from his right eye. He ended with a polite cough, followed by a hesitant sniff. The crowd erupted into scattered nods and one very enthusiastic coin toss. It was, by all accounts, a thoroughly acceptable yawn. History would remember it as the most decent display of fatigue in living memory. And the kingdom slept soundly that night, some from exhaustion, others from natural indifference. And while Egbert retired to his quarters for a well-deserved chamomile and a nap of national importance, a letter awaited him, a message that would gently rattle even his unwavering dullness. It was from his cousin, Queen Mildred of the Northern Marshes, and she was, rather unusually, inviting him for a visit, with urgent tea. There are kings who gallop into battle with swords aloft, and there are kings who commission majestic works of art. And then, there is King Ethelbert, the occasionally attentive, whose deepest passion, other than a good nap, was the kingdom's balance sheet. Yes, dear listener, the most thrilling moment of his royal week came every Thursday, just after lunch, when the Treasury clerk delivered the royal ledger wrapped in lamb's wool and tied with a string made entirely of local flax. It was the 13th century, and like most of Europe, Ethelbert's kingdom had the excitement level of an unused butter churn. The peasants churned, the chickens clucked, the sheep stared absentee-mindedly at the horizon. But up in the draughty stone corridor of the royal castle, a man paced excitedly in his velvet socks, waiting to read about flour taxes and sheep tariffs. And oh, what a ledger it was! A great bound volume, weighing roughly as much as a well-fed raccoon, filled with entries like 3 bushels of barley from Tenant Hob, discovered to be slightly damp, noted. Or 10 shillings spent on replacement window glass after Sir Osric practiced falconry indoors. King unimpressed. Ethelbert would sit in his favourite accounting chair, carved from the least splintery beech tree in the village of Lower Snoodley, and trace each entry with a finger sticky from the remains of a plum tart. Numbers thrilled him. Rows and columns were his ballroom, decimals his dance partners. While courtiers dreamed of jousting tournaments or secret court romances, Ethelbert dreamed of correcting minor math errors in cereal exports. It wasn't that the king was without taste. For example, He insisted every ledger entry be penned in royal ink, a mixture of soot, hare's blood, and a single feather from his favourite duck, named Philip. Philip, like the king, enjoyed long periods of brooding silence and the quiet rustle of parchment. But let us not think him cold or unfeeling. No, Ethelbert cared deeply about the small, nay, microscopic details of good governance. He once spent 4 consecutive evenings meditating on an accidental overcharge of 2 farthings for chimney repair in West Dunfeld. According to court gossip, the man responsible for the mistake was sent to the tower, not to be punished, but to be comforted gently, and asked how the error arised, over warm mead and spiced oatcakes. In many ways, Ethelbert saw the entire universe as a kind of ledger. People owed and were owed. Sheep were shorn and counted. Walls crumbled and were rebuilt down to the groat. Even grief, he once said during a particularly moving budget meeting, ought to be measured kindly and with care, lest we leave love unaccounted for. Was this poetic? Possibly. Was it exciting? Absolutely not. But it was deeply, profoundly boring in a wonderfully consistent way, like the ding of a grandfather clock or the dependable lull of rain on a shingled roof. He had a favourite number, 47. Not for any mystical reason, but because it was satisfying, quietly ambitious, yet rarely troublesome. And to the king, that was the ideal character, neither loud nor chaotic, a number that worked hard and didn't crave attention. Indeed, the only time Ethelbert raised his voice in 27 years of rule was during a furious row over unexplained discrepancies in the fish tax. "I demand tranquility in arithmetic," he allegedly shouted, before promptly fainting with stress and missing the next meeting of the Royal Committee on Turnip Standardization. Despite his dramatic feint, the court adored their monarch. His peculiar devotion to fairness meant servants were paid on time. Roads were modestly but reliably maintained, and even the squirrels in the palace garden were allotted precisely balanced walnut rations. The squirrels, unaware of their brief political fame, remained neutral. So if you're wondering whether a king might find fulfillment not on a battlefield or in a grand hall of mirrors, but rather within the gentle hum of calculated fairness, Ethelbert did, and profoundly so. Under his mild and accountant-minded reign, the kingdom was, as one travelling bard put it, in a song that quickly fell out of favour, flourishing gently like bread that's not in a hurry. Outside, it rained again, as it often did, and Ethelbert closed his ledger for the evening. "All accounted," he whispered to Philip the duck, who blinked in solemn agreement, and as the hearth crackled beside his chair and the quill was laid to rest, a curious letter arrived from a distant cousin. A cousin with troubling thoughts about carpets, colour, and a revolutionary idea called courtly fashion. But that was a whole new kind of tax trouble. Once upon a drizzle, in a castle more beige than bold, King Hubert, the humbly predictable, signed up for his newest and possibly sleepiest pastime, the Royal Teacup Society. Now to clarify, this was not a society of teacup collectors. That would have been simply too thrilling. No, this was a gathering of noble persons who sat very still, on high-backed chairs, in a draughty, echo-prone parlour, and did nothing but sip a precisely measured ounce of lukewarm tea, once every quarter hour. You see, King Hubert had tried everything to fill his royal hours: lawn appreciation, cloud cataloguing, and even extreme embroidery. He'd once stitched an entire map of the kingdom using only beige thread, but alas, no one could see it. But nothing delighted him quite like the meditative monotony of teacup murmurs. Each Thursday afternoon, Just as the castle's third-best sundial indicated mostly cloudy o'clock, the society would shuffle into the Pale Room. It was called the Pale Room not because of any paint colour, but because everything inside, including the guests, refused to be vibrant. There was Lord Egbert of the Ever Yawns, who only blinked once every 10 minutes. Next, Lady Winifred of the Wilted Flowers, famed for her annual speech on the evolution of chair legs. Then came the Honourable Sir Piloton, who once sat so still he was mistaken for furniture and dusted by the palace maids. And reigning over them all, in his slightly too roomy throne upholstered in oatmeal velvet, was King Hubert himself. He did wear a crown, yes, but only because it served as a handy coaster between sips. The afternoon tea ritual was strict but soothing. First came the steeping, 12.5 minutes of gentle leaf immersion in silence. Next, the cooling gaze, where each member stared at their tea without flinching, allowing it to reach precisely 48.3 degrees Celsius. Then came the one sip. No more, no less. It was savoured longer than most weddings. Finally, participants would nod appreciatively to indicate, "It has tasted exactly as expected." It may sound uneventful, but to the boring king, this was understated ecstasy. Now, let us drift deeper into the Pale Room, where the king once had a truly mesmerising exchange. This was the meeting when Lady Winifred asked, in a voice so soft it could iron parchment, "Have we ever considered adding a biscuit?" Gasps echoed like accidental breezes. Sir Piloton dropped his monocle, mostly by accident, as it hadn't properly fit in years. King Hubert, ever the pillar of measured reaction, narrowed both eyes a single millimetre. "A biscuit," he murmured. "Crumbly, crunchy, dangerously flavourful." The council fell into hushed contemplation for nearly 57 minutes. Eventually, Lord Egbert offered, "Perhaps, an oat biscuit, mild, dry, square, if possible." And so, history turned ever so slightly that day, as the boring king approved, tentatively and with great ceremonial yawning, the introduction of the plain oat square. It was a turning point, really. Not for the kingdom, nobody actually noticed, but for the society itself. Now, each Thursday, after the sacred sip, a single oat biscuit was placed beside each teacup, accompanied by a small parchment scroll bearing the words, "Chew with modesty." Over time, the society compiled a ledger devoted solely to biscuit consumption moderation. They charted optimal bite sizes between 4.5 and 5.2 millimeters, detested dunking, far too interactive, and declared rebellious jam antics unbecoming of the crumb. Naturally, King Hubert led the biscuit board reviews, ensuring no flavour exceeded the legally bland limit. A visitor once asked the king what he thought of the society's influence. He replied, after a lengthy pause, "I believe it is precisely unremarkable enough to be remembered by no one, thus perfect." Indeed, across sprawling kingdoms and fiery courts elsewhere, kings held raging banquets and hunted foreign beasts, but none could compare to Hubert's unwavering commitment to quiet beverages and quieter crumbles. And so we leave this gentle gathering of tea scholars, where throne legs creak and biscuits break as softly as the morning fog. The Pale Room grows dim with twilight, its curtains never drawn, because nobody wished to interrupt the view of nothing in particular. Outside, a light mist falls over the mossy stones. Inside, King Hubert leans back just a little, eyes half closed, already pondering next week's tea temperature variation discussion. But what's this? A tremor on the table, a rustling of parchment. Something dull but unfamiliar is about to enter the king's rather repetitive routine, something that may just involve a library. But for now, rest your eyes like teacups returning to saucers. The evening deepens, and there will be time yet for shelves and sleepy scrolls. Deep within the limestone walls of the king's not-so-imposing castle, more of an overgrown manor, if we're being honest, there existed a room so obscure, so underwhelming in purpose, that even the royal mice refused to scurry through it. This, dear listener, was the royal chamber of personal accessories, a place filled with the soft sighs of forgotten hat boxes and the faint rustle of unceremoniously folded cloaks. And at the very back, on an unassuming oak chest, sat the centerpiece of King Egbert the Unremarkable's domestic kingdom, the royal sock drawer. Now, you might be wondering, surely a king doesn't sort his own socks? And that, friend, is precisely what made Egbert himself. While others rode forth in glittering armor to make war over land and ego, Egbert rose at precisely 6:57 each morning, stretched with the quiet resolve of a man who'd never been in a joust, and glided, yes glided, in thick woolen slippers to select the perfect pair of matching hosiery. There were beige socks, taupe socks, dove grey socks, and one scandalous pair in a muted forest green that Egbert only wore on feast days. Each sock, monogrammed with a sleepy E, was rolled and placed in rows according to season, thickness, and tendency to shrink in the royal wash. This passion for podiatric order was no idle pastime. It was a philosophy. You see, in the late 14th century, when nearly everyone else in Europe was raving about heroic quests, heretics, or the tantalizing idea of bathing once a month, Egbert championed the gentle consistencies. He believed greatness was not in battle, but in the quiet triumph of always knowing where your left sock was. Such notions baffled his courtiers. They'd gather in the long hall of murmured decisions, seated beneath a tapestry of a very mild hunt, deer politely declining capture, and await His Majesty's decrees. And day after day, he'd look up from his notes, smile faintly, and say something like, "Let the autumn tax be collected in copper buttons, easier to count, nicer on the thumb." And they'd all nod gravely, pretending this wasn't the first time a kingdom tried to back its economy with spare haberdashery. Now, back in the sock drawer, Egbert kept a tiny secret. Beneath the third wooden divider, just below the midsummer ankle cuffs, was the emergency pair. These were socks preserved from his coming-of-age wardrobe, still daringly striped in horizontal bands of navy and something that could only be described as ambitious maroon. He hadn't worn them in years, save for that one time when he accidentally held court with mismatched footwear after tripping into a puddle of mead. That day went down in palace memory as the slightly less unremarkable Thursday. Songs were absolutely not written about it, but don't mistake his sock devotion for frivolity. There was logic to it all, soft, unwavering logic, like a bedtime lullaby for the kingdom. In an age clamoring with chaos and ambition, Egbert's unchanging habits acted as ballast. His people, bless their bureaucratically blunted hearts, found comfort in his utter predictability. When the sun rose, they knew the tolls would be the same as yesterday. When the sun set, they knew the palace chimney would puff the same gentle smoke from the king's warming pan. And on Thursdays, they knew gooseberry jam would be served on toast cut diagonally, because Egbert believed the angle sharpens the flavour. Philosophers couldn't quite anchor a school of thought to Egbert, but one monk from North Helpshire did try. He called the king's way Stillionism, a belief that true power lies in gentle motions, neutral tones, and never ever running for anything unless you're being chased by bees. There, in the gentle quiet of his favourite chair, a chair whose upholstery matched no known fabric, but certainly encouraged naps. Egbert ruled on in the softest of ways, ruling not with a mighty scepter, but with the poised grace of a man who knew where all his socks were and could name 3 types of lint. As the dusk pressed its blush against the castle walls and the candlelight curved into warm commas, the king took a sip of tepid tea and reached for his daily crossword, written by his cousin Reginald, whose idea of wordplay was hay bale and milded. And as Egbert softly mumbled the clues to himself, the castle settled around him like a woolen blanket. Outside, not a single rebellion stirred. Not a single envoy stormed the gates. History, it seemed, agreed to doze a bit, but just around the velvet-sided corner of the palace corridor, beyond the room of quiet mops and the hall of organized goose calls, an event most curious was about to occur. Something that, even by Egbert's yawning standards, would raise an eyebrow, just very slowly. Let's wander there next. Long before spreadsheets and taxes gently haunted us in the modern world, there existed a king, our remarkably boring king, who found comfort in collecting things of exceptionally mild significance. Not jewels, not silks, not even relics from the Holy Land. No, His Majesty's heart belonged to spoons. Yes, spoons. Silver, pewter, wooden, bent, short, long-handled, or gently tarnished spoons. The more utterly average, the better. The year was 1721, and a light drizzle misted the castle windows, forming sleepy rivulets that trailed down the glass like yawns in liquid form. Outside, sheep bleated softly in the distance, unaware that history, albeit the softest kind, was currently being forged at the royal breakfast table. King Edwin the Unremarkable, as he was affectionately uncalled by any of his subjects, because no one talked about him much, dabbed his lips after a breakfast of porridge and bread that made oatmeal seem spicy. With regal determination and slightly milky breath, he turned to his royal clerk of utensils, a man named Percival Dabblethwaite, whose very name sounded like a sneeze in a church. "Gentle Dabblethwaite," the king announced with a sleepy sort of drama, "we must take stock of the spoons." Dabblethwaite, who took to bureaucracy like ducks to lukewarm bathwater, brightened at once. "A full census, Your Majesty." "Yes, a nationwide reckoning. Wooden, silver, horn, and pewter. No rod shall go uncounted. We are a kingdom of humble efficiency, and we must know." And so, the most delightfully unnecessary decree in the kingdom's notably quiet history was enacted. Heralds were dispatched, carrying scrolls scrawled with the Spoon Proclamation of 1721. Trumpets bleated out in C minor, a sleepy key used only on Wednesdays, and somewhere in the distance, a farmer's dog sneezed softly. The citizens of the realm met the royal spoon census with a mixture of confusion, bemusement, and a level of enthusiasm usually reserved for watching paint dry, slowly and only during Lent. Spoon counters, known officially as royal enumerators of ladlesome assets, fanned out across hills, glens, hamlets, and forgotten hedgerows. They carried clipboards, made from the flattest trees and quills so dull they wrote in lowercase even when shouting. "Good day," one enumerator might say to a sleepy goat herder in woolen socks. "We're here about your spoons." "Ah, yes," the herder would reply, pushing aside an idle chicken. "3, all chipped. 1 bends when you look at it." The enumerator would mumble approvingly, jotting it down as eccentric silver, haunted. From the highland locks to the shoeless towns, along the mud-puddled roads, spoons were dutifully counted, sometimes twice for good luck, and always seasoned with the faint fragrance of boiled turnip that lingered perpetually in the air. At the palace, as reports trickled in like molasses in exile, King Edwin beamed with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally organized his sock drawer after 20 years of gentle avoidance. The final tally arrived in a scroll the length of an average peasant, or two if they stood shoulder to shoulder and were quite slender. The kingdom contained precisely 243,007 spoons, 17 of which had mysterious notches, and one that exhibited what was described as mild ambition. "Remarkable," the king murmured, his eyes mistier than the Moor's. "I knew we were a spoon-wealthy people." "It shall be remembered, sire," said Dabblethwaite, almost whispering from reverence, or perhaps the warm pudding he'd recently consumed. And remembered it was, though not in song, nor in tale, nor even in slightly bored gossip at the market. No, the spoon census of 1721 was carefully filed away, dusted once per decade, and consulted only once again in 1823, when a clerk mistook it for a meat inventory and confused half the village of Thistlewhim into thinking they were out of gravy forever. As the candlelight flickered over the parchment, the king sipped sleepily at his chamomile tisane, unaware that his next administrative obsession, a full audit of the kingdom's barn door hinges, was already creaking its way into the edges of his dreams. It had rained for 13 days straight in the kingdom of Normandy, but not really, and the puddles were beginning to unionize. The tulips were rioting. The palace ducks petitioned for a longer moat. Meanwhile, King Hubert the Unremarkable, the soggy sovereign of our bedtime tale, stood motionless on the eastern balcony of his melancholy limestone palace, gazing out across his waterlogged realm with all the interest of a half-eaten crumpet. "We'll need the blue boots," he murmured, to nobody in particular. Now, the blue boots were not just any boots. They were custom-made, calf-high, rubber-soled symbols of regal indecision. A gift from the entire village of Glump-on-the-Wold. They were painstakingly crafted from the innards of 37 goats who had very kindly donated their services posthumously. They squeaked when you walked, and somehow when you stood still. The king loved them. You see, Hubert refused all forms of excitement, including but not limited to warfare, falconry, spicy vegetables, and decisive governance. But on rainy days, oh, those blessedly wet, misty afternoons, he could be found donning his squeaky blue boots and walking precisely 13 steps into the royal garden. Any more than 13, and he risked encountering other humans, or, he shuddered at the thought, flowers. The palace garden, by the way, was not so much a garden as it was a soggy rectangle of moss and regret. It had once been designed by a famous landscape artist named Sir Geoffrey the Excessively Ambitious, who arrived full of grand ideas and left 3 weeks later in tears. King Hubert had rejected every flourish. Grotto, too whimsical. Fountain, wasteful. Hedge maze. A trap for the brave, Hubert had called it, nose wrinkling as if bravery emitted some unpleasant odour. Instead, the garden featured a single bench, slightly off-centre, a mossy rock, possibly sentient, and a lovingly pruned weed that had no idea it had achieved fame. And yet, this humble patch of green and grey was the king's favourite place in all the world. On the 13th day of rain, something positively reckless happened. The king reached for his teal cloak. Now, historically speaking, this was a moment of quiet rebellion. Think of Napoleon crossing the Alps. Think of Queen Elizabeth II giving her speech at Tilbury. And now imagine softly damp Hubert slipping into a cloak that had not one, but 2 decorative buttons. A move so radical it could send the court haberdasher into cardiac upset. Why the teal cloak? No one quite knows. Perhaps he felt inspired by the particularly assertive way a raindrop slid down the balustrade. Or maybe he was trying to match the blue boots in some daring chromatic ensemble. But it was enough to startle his valet Charles, who promptly stepped on a rake. "Going out, Your Majesty?" Charles asked, flattening his new bruise with polite interest. "Yes," Hubert said. "All 13 steps, possibly 14. Charles's left eyebrow twitched in alarm. Out the king squelched, one squishy boot after another echoing proudly and a bit obnoxiously across the cobblestones. The palace staff gathered in discreet horror behind steaming windows, dramatically clutching lace curtains like characters in a romance serial. 13 steps, pause, reflection, damp squirrel sighting, a long, meditative sigh. Then, step 14, record scratch. It was not planned, it was not endorsed, it was not technically safe. But the king had taken an extra step, and now he found himself face to face with the mossy rock. It seemed larger today, possibly due to its diet of ambient disappointment. For a moment, they regarded each other. Two monarchs of distinct kingdoms, one of stone, one of starch. Then, in a display of unprecedented daring, the king sat on the bench for over 4 minutes. And during those 4 miraculous minutes, a tentative sunbeam pushed through the clouds like a shy intern interrupting a board meeting. It gently kissed the king's shoulder, incidentally brightening the teal cloak and causing it to shimmer in a way that could only be described as moderately daring. Court poets would later write roughly 7 poems about it, all mediocre but earnest. The rain soon resumed, as it always did, but the kingdom would remember this day, the day the king faced the rock, wore the teal cloak, and sat on a bench, changing nothing, but changing nonetheless. As the dusk crept down the palace walls and puddles sharpened their reflections, King Hubert slowly stood, adjusted his boots, and stepped quietly back inside. His royal squeaks echoed down the corridor like the soft applause of watching ghosts. And somewhere, behind the tapestry of stationary tulips near the library, a letter had just arrived. Unopened, important, and entirely inconvenient. But that is another sort of silence for another sort of hour. Imagine a Tuesday morning that lasts for 40 years. That, more or less, describes the reign of King Egbert the Unruffled, of lower northwestern, slightly above average Albion. In this chapter, we visit the golden years of his rule, a time so utterly peaceful that historians weren't entirely sure whether to record it or take a nap instead. The year was 1207, and everything was pleasantly mediocre. The kingdom had no wars, no plagues, and the crops were doing just well enough to make conversation at harvest festivals comfortably bland. King Egbert's royal agenda was, as usual, empty, except for an hour of contemplative loaf-sitting, 3 perfunctory nods to the steward, and the traditional midday sigh. It's often said that great leaders are defined by the crises they face. Egbert was defined primarily by his ability to avoid them entirely, and not through strategic genius or diplomatic cunning. It's simply that no one could be bothered to invade a kingdom where the most exciting military development was a slightly better shoe for marching uphill. "Why bother with Egbert?" asked the king of neighbouring Wenthbridge once, over his 3rd goblet of gooseberry cordial. "If we conquer him, who'd notice?" Even the royal guard, the most mildly courageous knights of the sedate table, found themselves with little to do. Their armour was polished once a month by a cheerful woman named Maureen, and had more shine than scratches. The only known conflict during the entire decade came during a bake-off, when Sir Terence of Crumbly accused Lady Winifred of using artificially thickened custard. She had, but he was just jealous. In the capital city of Tittle-on-Blanket, days drifted by like woolly clouds in a tea-stained sky. The taverns dispensed stories of medium intrigue and ale of adequate temperature. The chief entertainments were sheep-counting tournaments and the annual festival of the mildly interesting vegetables. One year, a turnip in the shape of a slightly dismayed owl brought the town square to hushed amusement. Meanwhile, King Egbert would spend long mornings in his garden, speaking softly to his tulips. He wasn't lonely, at least not in any alarming way. He simply preferred plants because they didn't ask follow-up questions. His favourite was a particularly tidy dahlia he nicknamed Sir Petalhauser, and once mistakenly knighted in a moment of particularly soporific sunlight. The economy, too, was firmly stable. Not booming, not busting, just sort of budgetary porridge. Taxes were reasonable, largely because calculating anything more complicated would have required the royal mathematician, Agnes of Somehow Still Awake, to do long division, an act she reserved for leap years only. Historians have long puzzled over Egbert's success. How can a kingdom flourish by doing practically nothing? But perhaps that's the secret. Peace often grows not where flags wave, but where they softly droop in the breeze next to a well-tended hedge. Even the clergy had little to rebuke. The Archbishop of Sleepington issued 14 gentle sermons on the virtues of modest digestive habits, and once gave a particularly stirring homily about the importance of not leaning back too far on a wooden stool. It was a realm of contented sighs, reluctant ambition, and plenty of seating. But this sort of unruffled existence couldn't last forever. History, like a bored pigeon, eventually lands where it likes, and the 1210s were coming. With them, whispers of a group known only as the Dusty Reformers. 3 monks and a retired chicken keeper with radical ideas like twice-a-day bread and teaching the alphabet backwards for sport. For now, the stillness clung sweetly to the land, like light drizzle soaking gently into moss. Egbert, in his robe of agreeable dampness, leaned from his window one grey afternoon to observe a snail taking a decisive left turn. He nodded with profound approval. "Remarkable," he said, and then he dozed off. As the snail completed its somewhat tepid journey, the kingdom slept on, unaware of the soft shuffle of change approaching like a quiet librarian with new rules about overdue scrolls. And somewhere, just beyond Tittle-on-Blanket, someone was planning to issue a complaint. In the next chapter, perhaps we'll wander delicately into that. But for now, let's stay with Egbert and the snail a moment longer, and breathe in the slow, delicious scent of moss and monotony. As the dusk of protocol settled gently over the castle, and the fireplaces glowed with the energy of precisely 1.5 logs, King Egbert the Unremarkable prepared for another profoundly moderate evening. Some monarchs reigned with sword and ambition. Egbert ruled with slippers and a schedule no more exciting than a lukewarm bath. We find him now, enthroned, not on his royal chair, but on a squashy, entirely forgettable velvet settee in the lesser hall of moderate importance. It was a room specifically designed to appear more significant than it was, and equally effective at lulling large council meetings into accidental naps. And so this chapter, dear listener, is not one of battles or betrayals, but one of the Chamberlain's slippers. Now, the Chamberlain, Lord Percival Drowsington III, was a man of exceptional punctuality and average everything else. His slippers, well, they were the cause of great bureaucratic intrigue one Wednesday afternoon. Though billed as Parliament-appropriate footwear, They were, in unfortunate truth, lined with the fur of a rather luxurious, shaggy sheepdog. This rendered Lord Percival's every step a soft shuffle, like a whispering snowdrift across a silent floor-boarded sea. Oddly enough, this shuffled gait became infectious. Ministers from all departments began requesting reduced decibel office wear. The Minister of Coin had hers fitted with felt. The royal herbalist, confusing the trend for a health initiative, opted for sandals made of dried chamomile and oat husks. The castle halls bloomed with the gentle mufflings of 1,000 slumber-seeking statesmen. What resulted was the great muffled march of the Ministry of Quills, a sleepwalking procession that began in the records room and, 45 minutes later, startled a cat in the South Tower before collapsing into the tea pantry like dominoes made of respectable boredom. Egbert, meanwhile, was reading aloud minutes from the previous week's Public Fence Post Budget Review. And therefore, under the newly amended Clause 8A, Fence Maintenance Continuity Addendum, all northern village fences of minimal slope shall receive 1/2 coat of rain-resistant bark wash. At which point, a soft snore erupted from behind the tapestry, depicting the Battle of Moderately Defended Turnips. There was no battle, of course, just a misunderstanding about vegetable taxation and poor signage. But it was considered patriotic art all the same. The snoring was, unsurprisingly, the Chamberlain himself, who had mistaken the tapestry alcove for the lavatory of contemplation again, a room invented, allegedly, for thinking but more commonly known for its tragic shortage of toilet paper and surplus of eucalyptus-scented riddles etched into the stone. "Percival," King Egbert whispered kindly, not moving an inch, for movement upset the balance of his tea tray. "Would you mind not dreaming quite so audibly? I'm at the pivotal part about fence post varnish." The Chamberlain stirred like honey in porridge. "Your Majesty, I dream only of civic clarity," he murmured, adjusting his left slipper to a more contemplative angle. There was a pause as the fire sighed softly, and the council resumed pretending to be awake. Somewhere near the window, the Duke of Buttons, who oversaw the increasingly unnecessary button census, was meditating with his eyes open and brain entirely checked out. And so, under ceilings that yawned like politely restrained opera singers, policy continued. By decree of a king whose greatest ambition was timely puddings and whose war strategy was best summarized as, "Let's avoid all that," civil life flowed like decaf tea, rarely bitter, often room temperature. The kingdom's defense budget, primarily spent on umbrellas with custom embroidery. Royal Drizzle Deterrent, Model EG3. The fleet, 5 rowboats and a goose with a respectable posture. And yet, somehow, miraculously, nothing ever truly went wrong. Or right, mostly sideways with grace. Even the jester, a man whose enthusiasm far outweighed his comedic impact, had taken to simply narrating the tedium in rhyming couplets. "Behold, good folk, the ink doth dry on tax form 9B, subsection Y." A royal favourite, mostly because the rhyme didn't require anyone to look up from their candlelit crossword scrolls. As the castle moonlight pooled on parquet floors, and the scent of wisteria and tepid stew wafted through corridors built for modest grandeur, Egbert leaned back. Somewhere, beyond this room of foggy thoughts and courteous slippers, awaited the next slow ripple of regal routine. A gentle clink of teacup on saucer marked the close of day, and as the king whispered goodnight to his bingo card of policy reviews, a new parcel arrived, sealed with ornate ribbon and twine. Ah, but what was in the parcel? That, dear listener, unfolds next, like an overcomplicated napkin at a very official dinner. Somewhere in the stone-tucked belly of the king's castle, down a drafty corridor marked only by a misbehaving tapestry and the faint scent of ink, sat the Bureau of Royal Correspondence, a name which sounds much more exciting than it faithfully deserves. And within that windowless chamber of parchment and yawns, His Majesty, our dearly dull King Egbert the Unremarkable, settled in for what he called a lively bout of letter writing. Now, if you're picturing lively as in Shakespearean duels of wit and romantic declarations, please do gently downgrade your expectations to Latin grammar complaints, polite request to a neighbouring duchy about better performing turnips, and one rather long, meandering note to his second cousin in Bohemia about the merits of wool over flax socks. Riveting. The rain tapped gently at the castle walls, a drizzle so committed to monotony that it practically sang a lullaby in Morse code. Inside, the candles flickered with a sweet indifference to history, as if time itself was as sleepy as the rest of us. Egbert took his favoured quill, the one that didn't squeak like a mouse when dipped, unfolded a blank parchment with the tender caution of someone cradling a soft-boiled egg, and got to work. "Dearest Heinz," he whispered aloud, composing the letter as he wrote, "I do trust you've maintained a rigid oat schedule, as per our last discussion. The footmen swear by it." His royal scrivener, a man named Roger of Droning, sat nearby like a well-trained fern, present, largely silent, and occasionally rustling when a note required duplication. Roger had held the post for 14 years. He had once told a scribe apprentice, the king's most emotionally turbulent letter involved a delay in the shipment of wicks. It was a 7-page grievance. I wept only once. Outside the chamber, knights practiced clanging things into other things, but inside the scratching of quill on parchment provided the only rhythm, a sort of sleepy metronome that hypnotized even the ink. Egbert's handwriting was unremarkable, naturally, a perfectly average blend of slightly too wide loops and cautious lowercase r's. Every letter, and there were many, was methodically folded with a royal fold, the kingdom's chief innovation in origami. Not artistic, just precise. Each finished note was sealed with wax bearing the king's noble crest, a potato and 2 crossed spoons. What's often forgotten in the fanfare of monarchies and epic histories are days like these. Days where a king must, by the rigid expectation of royal duty, correspond with the world through postal monotony. The archives of the realm's letters, stored in a room so dusty even spiders refused to visit, contain years of Egbert's gentle observations. Tried boiled cabbage alongside beef tonight, adequate. Replaced moat fish after Viscount Montgomery claimed they looked sad. The royal cat continues to ignore me. Possible betrayal. Yes, the pen might be mightier than the sword, but in Egbert's hands it was mostly baffled. And yet, strangely, comfortingly, there was purpose to it all. In every letter, regardless of content, King Egbert inscribed a little note in the margin, something only the recipient would recognize. A joke between childhood friends, a shared memory of stepping in goose droppings during a parade, or a cryptic reference to a lost mitten in the snow of '83. For all his mind-melting tedium, the king understood tiny kindnesses. A boring king, to be sure, but a considerate one. As another candle surrendered to the damp air, Egbert let out a sigh, almost melodic, like a lute playing a C- chord. Roger unfurled the parchment for the final letter of the day. To the royal chair upholsterer, Egbert began. Regarding the persistent creak when seated, catastrophic during royal silences, please advise. The scribes would file it away later in the department of possibly important, but mostly annoying things. Twilight crept over the windows they didn't have, the air thick with old ink and paragraphs. Egbert rubbed his temple gently, then asked Roger if he thought chairs could dream. Roger, who had long ago accepted such queries as normal, replied, "Only of upholstery, sire." The king nodded, as if mystified by his own thoughts, and rose to go. And as the echo of his soft footfalls vanished into the corridor, a neglected letter fluttered gently to the floor, half finished, addressed to someone named Edith, sealed only by a careless yawn. Perhaps tomorrow they would find it. For now, the quills rested, the ink congealed, and the kingdom sighed in the sleepy language of paper and dust. Somewhere overhead, a puddle rippled beneath a dripping gutter, and in the hush of a perfectly uneventful evening, the world turned quietly on. Begging the next question, what could possibly be less interesting than chair creaks and oat schedules? A royal dinner, perhaps, but that is for another night. It was a rainy morning in the kingdom of Cromes upon Mumble, a land so uninvolved in world affairs that the sun forgot about it entirely and relied on cloud gossip to get updates. Through the gentle patter of rain on mossy turrets, King Egbert the exceptionally unexceptional sat stiffly in his favourite gloomy chair, a piece of furniture so disinterested in supporting anyone's back that it creaked in protest with every sigh he made. The Royal Advisory Council, a collection of equally unmoving minds, had gathered for their weekly meeting. These sessions were originally scheduled quarterly, but ever since someone lost track of time in 1412, they simply declared them as needed, which somehow became Wednesday mornings for the next 37 years. Egbert adored these meetings in a way only someone who also adored lukewarm turnip soup and inventory spreadsheets could. They required no decisive leadership, no lavish charisma, and, blissfully, even less excitement. Seated to his left was Viscount Humberley, master of the royal ledger, and known for his thrilling monologues on hay procurement. To Egbert's right, Lady Blenchworthy, Minister of Overcast Affairs, whose primary jurisdiction included sighing at windows and predicting drizzle 2 weeks late. "Your Majesty," began the Viscount, gently tapping his quill against his preposterously thick ledger. "This week's surplus in cabbage has not been matched with an appropriate deficit in enthusiasm." Egbert blinked slowly. "Fascinating," he murmured, voice barely audible above the suspicious gurgle of someone's damp boots. "Should we perhaps consider more signs?" Lady Blenchworthy suggested, her voice carrying the same energy as boiled grey cloth. "Signs explaining that extra cabbages are now being stored near, but not quite inside, the east well." Egbert pondered this with the intensity of a marshmallow. "Yes," he said at last, "signage is a noble art. Let it be so." The council nodded solemnly, as if they had just solved an ancient riddle rather than decided to hammer up a wooden plank that read, "Please mind the partial cabbages." Now, one might expect royal councils to debate wars, taxes, or the affairs of powerful dukedoms, but not in Cromes upon Mumble. The most heated debate they'd had in living memory involved someone proposing to call the guards new boots, defeat defenders. Tempers flared briefly. A tea break was taken. And then there was the mysterious matter of the toadstools. Sir Whimsy of the Gardeners' Guild had sent a parchment note with slightly alarming calligraphy, warning that toadstools were forming ominous circles along the northern hedgerow. "I fear it may be a witch's ring," the note read, "or perhaps mushrooms just find each other terribly interesting." Egbert furrowed his brow in what was either concentration or a slow-forming headache. Perhaps we should consult the royal herbalist. Lady Blenchworthy cleared her throat. He fled during the great dill shortage of 14, Your Majesty. Took to the hills claiming the fennel had betrayed him. Ah yes, Egbert whispered. Treacherous fennel, a cautionary tale. The group fell silent, contemplating both fungi and the emotional toll of under-seasoned broths. Outside, the rain had shifted to a soft mist, the kind that made you question whether it was raining at all, or if the sky was simply mistaking itself for soup. As the meeting continued with a detailed update on worm sightings in the royal courtyard, statistically unremarkable, according to Humberley, the king allowed himself a rare indulgence. He gazed dreamily out the narrow window slit. There, beyond the hedge and the hint of rogue cabbages, a heron flew lazily, trailing a thoughtless line across the misty sky. For a moment, Egbert wondered what it might be like to be such a creature. Silent, sweeping, unconcerned with signage or surplus root vegetables. But then the Viscount leaned in with something truly alarming. Sire, the ink supply is threatening to dip below tolerable predictability. Egbert turned back at once, blinking away any thoughts of avian freedom. There were ledgers to be filled. Blank margins were not to be tolerated, not on his watch. With a sigh of gentle resolution, he nodded. We must act then. Let us ration the ink, 2 quills per advisor, and no flourishes. The council gasped quietly, enough that no one heard it. Swift and sensible. The kind of decisive action that put Egbert just barely on the map of obscure monarchs with excellent ink discipline. As pumpkin dusk settled over the kingdom, and the toadstools outside continued their peaceful conspiracy, Egbert leaned back in his chair. The day had been unusually productive. Only 6 pauses for melancholy and 1 mild itch mistaken for philosophy. Little did he know, a letter was already on its way from the Duchy of Possibly Important, sealed in curious wax and marked with urgency levels not seen since someone miscategorized a hedgehog as a royal envoy. But that story belongs to a softer hour, one arriving just around the sleepy corner. If you tiptoe softly enough through history, you'll often find the most curious things nestled right between the dusty scrolls and the dim candlelight of forgotten archives. And within one particularly rain-dampened parchment from the reign of King Edmund the extremely unremarkable, yes, our dearly dull monarch, you'll find of all things a comprehensive ledger of pigeons. Yes, pigeons. Feathered, fluttering, utterly pedestrian pigeons. But not just any pigeons. These were regal, registered, and accompanied by a rather extensive set of bylaws concerning cooing hours, authorized perching parapets, and grooming conduct suitable to court. You see, during Edmund's gloriously uneventful rule, messages were neither urgent nor particularly informative. Wars were not being waged, revolutions were napping, and the economy was humming along like a dozing lute player after lunch. So Edmund, in his ongoing quest to keep everything impeccably unimpressive, decided he would refine the royal communications system to match the pace of his own yawn-inducing soul. Enter the Royal Pigeon Registry of 1452. The registry had precisely 74 pigeons, each with its own name, rank, and aviary of origin. There was Sir Flufflebottom of East Loamshire, Lady Pexalot from the northern cloisters, and a particularly grumpy one simply known as Barry. Barry refused to fly more than 1 letter per week and was known to sit on windowsills glaring judgmentally at gardeners. As with most things under King Edmund's reign, this pigeon project required many, many meetings. The Committee for Aerial Dispatch and Feather Compliance met every Thursday in a damp little chamber that smelled faintly of biscuit crumbs and pigeon feet. These meetings were, enthusiastically speaking, excruciating. The minutes from one such gathering recorded a 2-hour debate on the appropriate colour of tiny velvet hoods to keep the royal pigeons from seeing unauthorised courtyards. "Let them be cornflower blue," one clerk insisted. "Cornflower, sir, is a summer hue, completely inappropriate for late autumn diplomacy," another countered, gravely swishing his quill through the air for dramatic flair. King Edmund, who only ever attended the first 10 minutes of these affairs before quietly slipping off for his third nap of the day, issued an official decree: let the pigeons wear whatever hood they so consent to be adorned with, provided it offends neither nobility nor poultry. This was widely regarded as one of the boldest statements of his reign. Now, a fair question might be asked. Why not simply deliver messages via human courier? Faster, perhaps even more dependable. But you see, speed and efficiency were not exactly crown virtues in Edmund's world. Time moved slowly in his court. Glacially, really. A letter sent via royal pigeon could take up to 8 days to flutter its way across the palace. By the time it arrived, most matters had already resolved themselves, often by forgetting they'd ever mattered. This suited Edmund perfectly. He once remarked during a tepid breakfast of boiled oats and silence, "The less one knows urgently, the more peace one enjoys." The pigeons, free from the tyrannical hustle of meaningful correspondence, lived lives of leisurely luxury. They were fed hand-selected millet from the royal granary. One particularly spoiled specimen, Prince Beakleton, had his own miniature chaise lounge next to the window of the royal conservatory. He preferred opera to chamber music and disliked rain unless observed from indoors. The registry itself became a peculiar source of pride. Tourists, well, the 2 that arrived one year, were led by a hesitant guard on a soggy tour of the royal loft. Children dreamt, not of knights or dragons, but of training their own pigeon to one day ascend to avian nobility. The pigeon registry inspired lullabies, idle songs, and one extremely out-of-tune hurdy-gurdy ballad that no one asked for but everyone tolerated, much like cold soup. And through it all, King Edmund presided with his usual limp enthusiasm, attentive for the first half sentence, warmly detached thereafter. A man who believed that even decisions about messenger birds ought to be made with the gentle deliberation of someone folding very soft laundry. To this day, buried in the ledgers of the royal archives, you can find the registry, complete with annotations in tidy cursive. Barry did not fly again this week. Morale among feathers remains neutral. So hush now. Let the pigeons coo softly in your mind like distant rustling pages. Outside the stone sills of Edmund's palace, rain gathered gently in pewter-coloured puddles, and inside, both king and birds alike, settled once more into patterns too slow to be remembered and too charming to be interrupted. After all, one never knows what thrilling nothing may unfold next. Gently. And so the rain continued, dribbling soft pats upon the castle windows, like a slightly bored percussionist trying not to wake a baby. Inside the greystone hulk there was the lesser palace of Witherfold upon Muddle. His Majesty King Edmund the Unremarkable faced his greatest adversary to date. An entire day with no appointments. It was a Tuesday. Not one of your dramatic Tuesdays that includes battles, treaties, or impromptu royal weddings. No, this was the slow-burning candle of Tuesdays, the kind that floats languidly on a calendar like an overlooked raisin in an exceptionally dry scone. Let us picture him now. King Edmund, robe slightly askew, sipping tepid chamomile from a cup shaped like a sheep. He was seated at the royal breakfast table, where the chief steward had presented the usual offering: 3 slices of unwarmed brown toast, a single pickled egg for morale, and a porridge that was legally oats but emotionally clay. "My liege," said Lady Pimblesworth, keeper of the weekday scrolls, who was only wheeled into the room when scheduling emergencies struck. Today, however, she floated in like a ghost, with nothing to haunt. "Your calendar is blank." Murmured Edmund, eyes drifting toward the curtained window. "I suppose one might rearrange the spoons." He did in fact spend no fewer than 40 minutes relocating 6 silver spoons from the left side of the salt to the right, then back again. Let us pause to admire the sheer courage of that sort of decision-making. By mid-morning, Edmund took a contemplative stroll through the gravel garden, so named not for its aesthetic properties, but because it was, quite literally, just gravel. Other monarchs might have commissioned fountains, topiary, or perhaps a stone goose or two. But Edmund found lively gardens a bit overstated, and once described flowers as plants that are trying too hard. As he stepped lightly among the crunching pebbles, the royal gardener, Mr. Gawk, appeared from behind a bush that wasn't there. "Morning, sire," said Mr. Gawk, tipping a hat that may have been a mittens pile. "Is that a new hat?" "No, your blandness. It's Tuesday." "Ah," said Edmund, as if this explained everything, and it very nearly did. After nearly tripping on his own feet in the most graceful way possible, the king returned indoors, where a fire had been lit in the royal lounge but not too lively room. This was the room where exciting things were intentionally not discussed. Its curtains were exactly the colour of overcooked cabbage, and the armchairs had been designed by committee not to incite enthusiasm. And yet, in all this beige serenity, something stirred. "The tea urn is bubbling," whispered Chamberlain Norris. "Not hissing?" Edmund asked, eyebrows tilting a fraction. "No, sire. Bubbling in a manner suggesting readiness for porridge." "Proceed," said the king. Tea was served. It was, as tradition decreed, lukewarm, greyish, and slightly herbaceous, like the memory of a garden dipped in sleep. For the next hour, Edmund read a book of known, documented sneezes from the previous century. He nodded appreciatively at the 1743 entry. W. Featherstone, 117. Noteworthy stride-shattering sneeze in Parliament's vestibule. Even then, the day refused to pick up speed. No invasions, no revolts, not even a mild complaint about road tolls. As the afternoon light drooped itself across the floor like a weary cat, Edmund glanced out at the drizzle that never quite became rain. "Perhaps I shall draft a new motto," he murmured, stirring his third tea of the day. "Calm and continue." Or maybe, "Gently does it." Lady Pimblesworth, now reclined with a felted footstool, offered, "What about eventually is soon enough?" Edmund considered this. Provocative. And thus the sun quietly retreated behind the thick curtain of fog that blanketed the kingdom like a polite but persistent uncle. Supper was, naturally, beige. A bread pudding with so little seasoning, it demanded applause for its restraint. As the castle torches were gently extinguished, not too suddenly, lest they alarm someone, Edmund readied himself for bed. He placed his crown atop the royal bedside potato, an object of dubious origin and entirely ceremonial function, then slipped beneath a quilt so heavy it had historical footnotes. The king closed his eyes, content. The day had been eventlessly perfect. Nothing had required change. No one had charged at him with a sword, and the milk delivery had been on time, if a little tepid. Somewhere outside, the rain whispered its applause. And deep in the bowels of the castle, an unexpected letter slumbered in the courier's satchel, bearing strange stamps, foreign ink, and just enough urgency to make tomorrow interesting. In the lavender hush of mid-afternoon, the drapes of the royal palace were drawn, not to conceal state secrets, but to sustain an optimal nap environment. Beyond the great hall's thick rugs and underwhelming tapestries, King Hubert, the exceptionally unremarkable, prepared to attend one of his most cherished weekly rituals, the Velvet Council of afternoon dozing. This council, no doubt unique among European monarchies, was not so much a governing body as a loosely organized assembly of half-asleep advisory nobles. Their purpose? To remain awake long enough to nod vaguely in agreement with whatever the king was mumbling, while simultaneously perfecting the art of strategic napping in elaborately cushioned chairs. You might call it governance if you were very generous, or very asleep. King Hubert, whose primary political legacy thus far included an impressive reorganization of the royal sock drawer, approached the chamber in his usual beige robe, adorned with precisely zero embroidery and flanked with sleeves ideal for quietly hiding digestive biscuits. He took his place on the throne of thoughtful slumber, little more than a stuffed armchair with a footstool that had once hosted a visiting ambassador by accident. The king cleared his throat, gently, as if addressing a room full of particularly sensitive owls. "My lords," he began with the rhetorical thunder of a distant drizzle, "what say we address the matter of public fountain scheduling?" From the corner, Viscount Mumbleforth stirred. He had perfected a technique known as wakeful snoring, allowing him to maintain the illusion of alertness while deeply lost in a dream involving treacle and foreign policy. "Indeed, your majestic averageness," the Viscount muttered, his monocle threatening to leap dramatically into his herbal tea. "I concur entirely with whatever you just said." Duchess Thistledown, who attended the council largely to avoid her household's energetic Pomeranian, peeked over her embroidery hoop without stopping her meticulous stitching of an aubergine. "I do enjoy a well-timed fountain," she said placidly. "Very good for the pigeons." With this vague approval secured, Hubert nodded to his secretary, a man of such forgettable presence that even his shadow had trouble remembering to follow him. The notation, "Fountains to be scheduled unpredictably for excitement," was dutifully scribbled in beautiful, copperplate handwriting, now destined never to be read again. But as often occurred during these sessions, the murmur of rain began to adorn the palace like sleepy applause through the stone walls. It pattered with the rhythm of a lullaby against the leaden glass windows, and suddenly Baron Rottenshins was face first in his cravat again. King Hubert, however, was not perturbed by this. In fact, he found it comforting, for nothing said peaceful rule quite like a snoring baron and the faint scent of lavender and pigeon crumbs in the air. Not all was drowsy harmony, however. Today's council had one minor point of disagreement: the new royal decree mandating that all court musicians perform only in the key of D-flat during Tuesdays with fog. "I say, isn't that a bit bold?" whispered Marquis Windle, whose idea of rebellion was wearing mismatched slippers by accident. The king considered this, tapping his chin with the soft edge of a biscuit he didn't realize he was still holding. "Perhaps C-sharp then," he mused, eyes closing slowly, as if the musical key itself held soporific qualities. A general hum of approval drifted through the room, though it might have been collective snoring. Thus concluded another productive meeting of the Velvet Council. Policies had been half discussed, refreshments half eaten, and several noblemen had nearly dropped their monocles twice, a sign, surely, of great legislative activity. The king gave a languid yawn, discreetly covering it with a sleeve that smelled faintly of yesterday's toasted oats. He leaned back in his throne, not entirely asleep, not entirely awake, perfectly balanced between the twin pillars of royal indifference and bureaucratic coziness. Through the window, the gardens began to ripple in the breeze, the stately hedgerows bowing delicately, like courtiers in slow-motion ballet. A lonely court jester wandered by, juggling 3 spoons with a melancholic grace, unaware that juggling was officially outlawed during nap time. In the great ledger of the realm, this day would be remembered as mildly accomplished, a solid rating in the kingdom of Drowsland, which hadn't seen the word crisis since they ran out of Earl Grey 20 years prior. Even that had only led to a minor hiccup in tea scheduling. As the light dimmed and another pot of chamomile was gently poured without incident, the pages of history turned softly, as if the book itself were resisting the urge to nod off. And just beyond the nap court twilighting into gentle discord, another quiet event was rustling in the colder corridors of the East Wing, an event that might require more than half a monocle's worth of attention. But that, dear listener, is a matter for next time, when we step softly into the chilly mystery of the East Wing umbrella inventory discrepancy. Some rulers collect riches, others collect enemies, but King Egbert the easily overlooked, our magnificent maestro of monotony, collected dust. Not intentionally, of course. It just sort of happened, like dew on morning grass or tea stains on scrolls. You see, King Egbert had what the court politely referred to as a profound interest in stillness. His throne room was a tribute to timeless inactivity. Stone benches lined the walls, not from lack of furniture funds, but because Egbert preferred the kind of atmosphere where no one sat too comfortably or moved too quickly. The air was thick with silence and increasingly dust. At first, it began in the corners, a gentle fluff, like the wool of invisible sheep grazing near the fireplace. But over the years, and oh, he ruled for a long, leisurely while, the dust developed into an almost sentient presence. Courtiers swore it shifted ever so slightly, like it had its own ambitions. Others whispered that the dust had grown to respect Egbert, as if it sensed a kindred spirit in his heroic resistance to movement. Now, let it not be said that King Egbert was unaware of the situation. There is, after all, a difference between being boring and being oblivious. Egbert noticed the dust. He watched it settle, rise and curl in sunbeams like sleepy dancers. Sometimes, during particularly long council meetings, that is to say, during any council meeting, Egbert would muse about awarding it the Order of the Brown Feather for its loyal attendance. But still, he refused to clean it. It adds texture, he said one morning, to no one in particular. And really, the dust did provide a medieval sort of atmosphere, like all his doors led not so much to rooms as to deep, historical metaphors. Of course, not everyone appreciated this aesthetic decision. The royal chamberlain, Sir Alabaster of Allergy, suffered acutely. He went about with watery eyes, a nose like a startled tomato, and the constant sound of a punctured bellows escaping him. The maids, too, wrestled morally with the king's wishes. Cleaning the palace was their pride, but how could they scrub away His Majesty's symbolic accumulation of eras? During this fine period of filth, scholars began dropping by, not to consult, but to complement the ecosystem. Nowhere else is history so literally preserved, one declared, sneezing into his annotated robe. Artisans arrived, attempting to press the dust into scrolls or turn it into budget-friendly cosmetics. They failed, but the attempt was soft and well-mannered. Things reached a whispery climax when a travelling philosopher proclaimed the palace to be a living reliquary of royal stillness. Egbert beamed. It was the proudest he'd ever looked while sipping lukewarm elderberry tea. Not to say the palace didn't suffer some minor drawbacks. As the dust achieved near governmental influence, messages were often lost in fuzz. Mice moved in comfortably, building ambitious labyrinths. Visitors began confusing the grand hall for a velvet cave. But Egbert, he remained serenely passive, surrounded by the grey fluff of time. Outsiders, naturally, found it all terribly peculiar. The King of Elswareshire sent a discreet ambassador with a broom-shaped peace offering. Egbert graciously accepted it and used it to stir honey in his porridge. And still, the seasons turned. Dust grew wiser. Egbert grew stiller. Each cobweb a bookmark, each speck a sleepy sigh in the kingdom of quietude. There was one particularly hushed evening, marked only by the faint sound of a quill losing hope, when a young page dared to ask the king, "Your Majesty, why let the dust stay?" Egbert, eyes soft as washed parchment, replied mildly, "Because, my dear, motion is the enemy of mystery, and sometimes the best way to remember time is to let it pile up a little." The castle exhaled quietly, and so did everyone inside. Beyond the windows, a gentle mist crept in, softening the world as if even the sky respected the king's philosophy. And just as the moon began its slow climb behind a cranky tower spire, Egbert turned to his council, many of whom had dozed off mid-thought, and said, "It seems a good night for a pause." And pause they did. Now, while the dust continued its slow and noble siege of the upholstery, something else was brewing, quiet, invisible, nearly inaudible, deep in the royal kitchens, a pudding crisis of epic proportions. Perhaps it was time Egbert stirred, slightly, maybe, eventually. By the time King Hubert the Unremarkable reached his late 50s, which in medieval king years is roughly equivalent to the mellow twilight of a warm Thursday afternoon, he had run out of interests. He was not particularly pious, artistic, or inclined toward diplomacy. His enthusiasm for cabbage cataloguing, while once spirited, had gently waned, and so, left to his own devices and the soft hum of boredom that seemed to be his kingdom's national anthem, Hubert turned to pigeons. Not falcons, no. That was far too glamorous. Falcons were for bold kings with sinewy wrists and dangerous capes. King Hubert preferred a sturdy cardigan and blankets with sleeves. Thus, he opted for the common rock dove, the bird most likely to poop on a statue and least likely to inspire poetry. This pivot toward pigeonry, a term we've invented because we're feeling fancy, was sparked by an event so mundane it barely qualifies as an event. One Tuesday morning, while sipping lukewarm elderberry tea and gazing at nothing in particular, King Hubert looked out from his stone balcony and observed a pigeon doing essentially nothing. The bird was perched on a gargoyle's nose, occasionally fluffing itself and looking vaguely suspicious, as if it were considering tax evasion. Hubert was enthralled. He believed, for reasons even he couldn't articulate, that this pigeon understood something profound, a serenity perhaps, or a secret to ruling that had always eluded him. And thus, the Royal Pigeon Advisory Council was formed. Yes, that happened. Technically, the council consisted of exactly one pigeon. But Hubert insisted upon bureaucracy, so 12 velvet chairs were arranged around a carved oak table in the East Tower's green room. They were never occupied, save for the pigeon, who preferred to linger in the rafters and occasionally desecrate the royal ledger. Soon, Hubert began holding council sessions every Thursday. He would arrive in his indoor cloak, which looked suspiciously like a bathrobe with embroidery, clear his throat ceremoniously, and pose hypothetical policy questions to the bird, who once nodded, which Hubert took as approval for increased oat rations in the West Fields. The court scribes were flummoxed. Sir Alistair the Dry, the kingdom's chief record keeper, and the only man to organise 50 years of harvest alphabetically, found himself recording minutes that read, "At 2:07 in the post-meridian, the Honourable Pigeon gave no discernible opinion about the bridge tax, though did appear to blink with a certain air of indifference deemed meaningful by His Majesty. Now, lest you think this was madness, let us step back and observe. Medieval kings consulted far worse things. Some sought omens in comets. Others trusted court jesters to advise on foreign policy. One even held counsel with a loaf of bread, though to be fair, it was a very convincing loaf. Compared to that, a pigeon seems almost statesmanlike. And in truth, the nation was more peaceful than ever. The pigeon proposed no wars, demanded no taxes. It didn't insult nobles, start crusades, or ban bagpipes. In contrast to other monarchs' advisors, this one was refreshingly silent and impossibly soft. What Hubert unknowingly discovered was the surprising competence of inaction. His pigeon meetings delayed rash decisions just long enough for better ideas to come along, often from the kitchen staff who, upon overhearing the king's soliloquies, would whisper suggestions to the steward, who'd relay them upward disguised as bird-inspired insights. Before long, peasants whispered of the king's wisdom. He listens quietly, they said, never lashes out, knows when to pause. These were noble traits by any standard, even if they were based on nothing more than mild indifference and an avian fascination. The pigeon became something of a celebrity. Artists painted it ambiguously holy. Monks composed odes. Naturally, Hubert commissioned a small portrait of the bird, wearing a crimson sash and looking wistfully toward a half-eaten pile of breadcrumbs. Even the Queen, who had long suspected her husband of being one long nap away from eternal slumber, seemed faintly amused. "At least he's not fighting anyone," she remarked, while embroidering daisies with mildly judgmental eyes. And so, the days meandered onward. The pigeon grew plump and content. Hubert began wearing softer robes and smiling more at clouds. There was talk, quiet, dreamlike talk, of official titles, perhaps Pigeon Chancellor, or Winged Council Extraordinary. These discussions never went far because, of course, the pigeon had no opinion. But that silence was his wisdom, and from that silence came calm. Now, as we close the door on the green room, where crumbs float gently in a shaft of golden light, let us drift further into the strange serenity of Hubert's court, to an even quieter place where the royal stargazer has made an exceptionally boring mistake. Some nights, dear listener, history feels like an old cat curled by the fire, content to purr, occasionally twitching, and very unlikely to do anything dramatic. Tonight is one of those nights, because this, you see, is the tale of a king who held a royal council meeting about spoons. Let's set the scene. The year is 1714, and the rain hasn't stopped for 3 entire days. Not that the king noticed. It was always raining where he lived, more or less. King Edmund the Mild, the most boring king in the world, sat embattled in what may well have been the least thrilling controversy of his reign, the curvature of the royal teaspoons. Yes, teaspoons. as in those humble tools of porridge shoveling and tea twirling. And yet, in a kingdom curated around meticulous dullness, the angle of a spoon was no small matter. The Royal Board of Table Formalities, a committee so dry they were once mistaken for furniture, had submitted its annual report. Attached, with a modest sense of alarm, was a complaint from the Duchess of Slushbury. She noted that her tea had overly agitated itself due to a slightly concave bend in the latest set of Palace teaspoons. Now, in most courts, a duchess sending complaints about tea movement would be calmly ignored. But King Edmund took this with the seriousness one might reserve for a thunderstorm or a helium shortage. He summoned the royal spoonwright, a man named Gerald Tremley, who had apprenticed under other Tremleys, none daringly creative, thank goodness, and had recently tried a slightly more ergonomic handle design. Gerald arrived in a frightful sweat, his shoes squelching softly, and was made to present the spoon in question before an assembly of nobles who had each brought their own tea for stirring trials. The Queen Consort, bless her sleepy heart, had fallen asleep halfway through the curvature debates and was gently snoring into an embroidery hoop. The Earl of Nothing Much noticed, but was too polite to mention it, and besides, he was embroiled in a deep philosophical quandary over whether a teaspoon could truly be dangerously modern. Edmund, who prided himself on his tact and unfailing neutrality, asked 3 very earnest questions. 1. Could the spoon still hold jam? 2. Would the new curve eventually scandalize the children? 3. Might this be a slippery slope toward tactical ladles? The court gasped at the last one. Sir Lionel Utterwim, keeper of napkin protocols, stood and declared that any spoon whose silhouette disturbs the tea swirl is a step toward anarchy. He proposed a 12-week investigation. Gerald disagreed, meekly suggesting that spoon innovation might help reduce wrist fatigue during the annual Marmalade Festival. This led to murmurs of wristy dangers echoing through the marble halls. After breaking for luncheon, cucumber slices arranged in alphabetical order, the council reconvened and voted 7-3 in favour of reverting the spoons to their former, slightly flatter state. The 3 dissenters were noted forward thinkers, later sent on a diplomatic mission to East Icelandshire, where nothing ever changed. Edmund signed the spoon recalibration edict with his usual custom. 1 drop of sealing wax pressed with a stamp shaped like a sleepy hedgehog. He declared, with all the solemnity of a barn owl after supper, that the realm shall not bend to whimsy in its teaspoons. That night, the rain turned to a mild drizzle. Somewhere in the kitchens, the head cook stirred her royal gruel and smiled. The spoons were predictably dull again, though, to be historically thorough, it should be noted that this particular debate made it into the annals of the Royal Archives under the heading Subtle Civil Instability, 1714. And so, the kingdom marched on, one bland decision at a time. Teas remained unagitated. Marmalade festivals continued without orthopedic injury. But stirring just below the surface of this puddle of bureaucracy, something peculiar was brewing, not in teacups, but in the royal gardens. Because you see, dear listener, the king's rose bushes had been moved ever so slightly, and not by royal decree. A sure sign that Chapter 18 may involve some horticultural intrigue, or, at the very least, an uncommon number of hedgehogs. By the time the most boring king in the world reached his 44th birthday, he had amassed a collection of hobbies so unthreatening to national security that not even the court's most dramatic chronicler could make them sound exciting. Among these noble pastimes was his deep and abiding fondness for cabbage. Yes, cabbage, not jewels, not falcons, not the intricate politics of courtly love. No, our king, whose name you no doubt forgot somewhere back in chapter 9, and who would kindly remind you it's Leopold IV of Wettenshire by the Wold, found his deepest satisfaction in the leafy, round-headed vegetable favoured by monks, peasants, and gardeners with low expectations for excitement. Each spring, Leopold would wander out to the palace gardens in his specially embroidered gardening robes, stitched with tiny embroidered cabbages that a very patient seamstress once had to spend a whole week on without bursting into confused giggles. He referred to them as his crisp ceremonial dress. With a sigh of seasonal anticipation, he would lean on a silver hoe, which he never actually used, and announce to the sky, "Let cabbage season commence." Witnesses were rare, for the court had learned to avoid him between planting and harvest, lest they be invited to his infamous evening of brassica, a symposium where an unfortunate fellow might be served boiled cabbage 7 different ways while enduring lectures about ideal soil acidity. To his credit, or his mystery, Leopold knew an astonishing number of cabbage facts. Did you know, for instance, that the Romans used it to cure hangovers? That's correct. Pliny the Elder once wrote that cabbage was effective at sobering drunks, which might explain why so many of Leopold's guests looked surprisingly alert after dinner, but curiously avoided wine altogether. As kingly obsessions go, it was harmless, even charming if you got used to the smell. But you might reasonably ask, what does a royal devotion to cabbage have to do with the burden of ruling a kingdom? Ah, dear listener, you've stumbled upon the leafy heart of the matter. You see, Leopold believed deeply in a theory of governance he once described during a particularly dull audience with a visiting ambassador from Bohemia. The cabbage, he said, while holding up a large specimen with solemn reverence, is the perfect model for statecraft. He explained, with great conviction and moderate enthusiasm, that the structure of a cabbage mimicked society itself, layered, dense, and occasionally soggy in the middle. Each leaf represented a different segment of the realm: the crunchy outer layer, the yeoman farmers; the pliable inner parts, artisans, scribes, and stablemen; and right in the core, the monarchy, small, under pressure, deeply unpopular with cooks. No one dared argue with this metaphor, mostly because it carried on for 45 minutes and was accompanied by dramatic slicing. Now, some kings sought glory on the battlefield. Others built soaring cathedrals. But Leopold, he decided to cultivate the royal cruciferous philosophy, drafting a 37-chapter treatise cleverly titled On Round Leadership, Musings from My Cabbage Patch. Did anyone read it? Not on purpose. A palace librarian did try once, but claims she blacked out halfway through chapter 6. Moisture retention and the morality of national debt. And yet, oddly, the kingdom ran smoothly, without fanfare, without conflict, and with an unusually high national surplus of sauerkraut. This quiet success only emboldened Leopold's belief that gentle governance, mellow, methodical, and mulch-friendly, was the proper way to rule. He even founded the Order of the Leaf, a royal honor bestowed on those deemed exceptionally calm, orderly, and unlikely to scandalize dinner guests. Courtiers began competing over who could be the least interesting, leading to such innovations as Silent Thursdays and polite nodding Olympics. And so, in the long, misted evenings of spring, as the hedgerows bloomed and small, bashful cabbages poked their heads from the soil like monks at prayer, Leopold would sit in his garden, wrapped in wool, sipping warm lettuce tea and smiling serenely. He had cultivated not only a lovely crop, but a kingdom allergic to drama, which, to be fair, was exactly what they needed after that unfortunate goose insurrection of 1323. And so the royal garden grew, and so did the quiet. The tulips leaned in conspiratorially, the hedges seemed to nod, but something, somewhere, was about to stir. Not dramatically, of course, just a little peculiarly. A letter, sealed in red wax and carried by a messenger historically known for being early, was already clinking in its satchel, heading toward the palace. And in the shadow of the sundial, something quacked. We'll save that for another night. By the time our dreary monarch, his serene yawnfulness, King Egbert the Unremarkable, reached the 43rd year of his impressively eventless reign, he had turned his curiosity toward the mail. Not receiving it, mind you. That would suggest excitement, but rather preserving it, organizing it, and then, heaven help us, cataloguing it. King Egbert, possibly the only sovereign in the history of Europe to equate national duty with the careful gumming of adhesives to tiny squares of paper, had discovered philately. Now, let us not demean stamp collecting. It is a noble sport, if your definition of sport includes no physical movement, drama, or external audience. But in Egbert's court, it blossomed into something deeper, a kingdom-wide campaign to issue the most uninspired postage imaginable. Each new stamp featured a different, profoundly boring scene from his monarchy. One depicted the royal corn audit of 1712. Another showcased the ceremonial changing of the candle sizes in the castle sconces. A third, a fan favourite if one can be so bold, displayed the royal dictionary, closed, beside a small inert turnip. The kingdom, too polite to laugh, but too awake to ignore, accepted these tiny squares of printed uneventfulness with an admirable lack of enthusiasm. Now, many monarchs turned to grand projects in their golden years. Warfare, world fairs, the occasional palace or child, but not Egbert. He directed funds not to cathedrals or conquests, but to the National Archive of Unsent Letters, which was built just behind the Shoe Tax Office and adjacent to the National Silence Observatory, which recorded moments when absolutely nothing happened, which was very often. Egbert had a particular liking for letters that began with "Dearest," and then wandered for paragraphs into apologies about the state of the weather, mild digestive complaints, and an unusual abundance of boiled eggs. These he deemed precious treasures of the realm and kept in special folders, sorted by how many times they referenced damp conditions. Now and then, when the royal advisor, Lord Humdrum, remarked on a foreign policy blunder or a minor economic crisis, Egbert would gesture absently toward a sealed stack of mail-shaped documents and murmur, "Put it in the collection." The court grew quiet in those years, still technically functional, but seeping with a passive haze like a library at nap time. The royal cat, Malcolm, had stopped hunting mice and instead began sleeping atop historical ledgers, which no one minded, as the ledgers mostly contained lists of missing teaspoons. Domestic policy slowed to a leisurely crawl, like a tortoise with a monocle and little interest in speed. Laws passed almost by osmosis. One simply drifted into effect after being sat on by 3 dukes and muttered over by a viscount with no firm opinions on anything. And yet, subtly, wonderfully, a kind of peace settled over the land. With so little happening, people began to notice small joys. The way light filtered through linen curtains, the thrill of finding exactly 5 peas on one's plate, or the gentle joy of mud that wasn't too wet and wasn't too dry. It was in these muted years that a new art form rose, still life theatre, where actors posed without moving in scenic displays of teacups and potatoes. The performances were surprisingly well attended. The royal garden grew lusher too, not for aesthetics, but because Egbert, after reading a treatise on root vegetables twice, directed that nothing with flowers be planted, only carrots, parsnips, and other entirely beige flora. As a result, the palace grounds became an award-winning showcase of the least colourful produce in Europe. Now, some, especially the ambassadors of livelier nations, sneered. But there was something quietly marvellous about a kingdom so dull. Even its scandals involved mislabeling the archival boxes of moth softness records. Yes, moth softness. There was, in fact, a scale. In his quiet way, Egbert had created a world that yawned its way into tranquility. A world of soft wool mittens, room temperature tea, and decisive mediocrity. But change, like a rogue pickle in a plum tart, was on the horizon. Something, or rather someone, was about to arrive at court with a spirit just a touch too curious for Egbert's comfort. Her hat alone would cause a stir. And so, dear listener, let your mind drift like an unsent letter on a breeze made of sighs as we turn the page to see just who might disturb the marvellous monotony. The rain had not stopped for 83 days, which suited King Egbert the Unremarkable just fine. Drenched hedgerows drooped like sleepy eyebrows, chamber pots steamed faintly in the morning fog, and the palace cats, 5 of them, had each claimed separate windowsills to stare disapprovingly at the weather. The world had embraced a cold, thorough dampness, and the king had once again lost a Tuesday. In the west wing of the royal manor, which smelled permanently of old ink and disappointment, Egbert had discovered something new. A cabinet. Now, to the ordinary eye, it was just a cabinet. Shorter than it looked, wider than it needed to be, and painted the precise shade of unbuttered porridge. But to Egbert, greatly impressionable and mildly baffled by furniture, it was the royal repository of objects almost worth keeping. Within this slightly warped cupboard, behind drawers labelled things like cordially misplaced and only slightly haunted, lay the long-forgotten spoils of a king's reign so dull, the scribes sometimes wrote their chronicles in pencil, expecting to change it later for whatever actually happened, which, in Egbert's case, was almost never. There was, for instance, the legendary teaspoon of feudal negotiation. It looked exactly like a normal spoon, mostly because it was. But according to a footnote in the Book of Mildly Important Events, Egbert had once used it to settle a land dispute between 2 squabbling barons by offering each of them a turn stirring tea until they calmed down. Astonishingly, this had worked. The spoon was shoved next to a cracked egg timer and a moth-eaten sash from the Order of the Slightly Chivalrous. Next to the spoon resided the royal sock stamp, an ivory-handled seal engraved with the words, His Majesty's left sock. This was because during a particularly drawn-out parliament, Egbert had declared a new system to avoid sock confusion among the noble class. Each sock was to be stamped with its proper designation, left, right, or ceremonial. The decree was met with tepid applause and forgotten 3 days later, except by an obsessive duke who now hosted sock-themed salons. Tucked behind a yellowing treaty with the Duchy of Somewhere or Other, which stated, quote, "We probably agreed to something reasonable," was King Egbert's most prized possession, the official map of his kingdom's pie vendors, as of a Thursday in March. This splendid chart, rendered in coloured chalks on a large piece of wood that once served as a tabletop, depicted every pudding stall, pie wagon, and wayward baker from coast to coast. It was not accurate, strictly speaking, but if one squinted, you could make out the legendary location of Fancy Jeff's damp tarts, which was said to cause spontaneous reminiscence and mild heartburn. Now and then, royal advisors would shuffle into the West Wing to inquire about policy, only to find Egbert half snoozing in a puddle of old festival flyers, stroking his collection of very unofficial seals. These seals, a badger holding a cucumber, a turtle wearing a crown, and a fish with suspicious eyebrows, had each been proposed by Egbert during various late-night inspiration fits. None, tragically, had been adopted by any heraldic authority. But to Egbert, they were still dear. It was said among stable boys and apothecaries that the king's cabinet held tremendous secrets. Some believed it contained an ancient scroll outlining the true purpose of hedges. Others whispered that it was a portal to a kingdom where it never rains, and everyone remembered what day it was. In truth, it mostly contained expired jam permits and mysterious keys that fit nothing and unlocked even less. Still, there was a quiet kind of magic in such a place. A cabinet where time had lost interest in passing swiftly, where forgotten things curled up together and dreamed of being remembered. Egbert, in his gentle way, had found a certain nobility in this sleepy museum of near importance. And as the storm winds nudged against the windows and the cats meowed in harmony with the creaking hallway, the king placed one last item inside, a peach stone from a perfectly ordinary afternoon. He shut the creaking door, labeling this drawer with careful block letters. Perhaps meaningful, possibly not. The candle flickered. Outside, the puddles deepened, and deep in Egbert's ancient comfy chair, a plan was beginning to drift through his rather slow-moving mind, a plan involving an annual royal festival of slightly interesting things. But plans, like socks, were best sorted 1 foot at a time. And so we drift onward to see what wonders, or reasonable facsimiles thereof, await. By the waning light of a drizzly afternoon, King Egbert the Unnoticed sat completely upright in his squeaky upholstered chair, gazing solemnly, though not entirely intentionally, at a chipped teacup. It rested on a doily that was once considered a family heirloom, until someone pointed out it was actually a malformed lace napkin. This, as it turned out, would become one of Egbert's most decisive diplomatic moments. Because in his reign, diplomacy rarely involved swords, but very often involved something either steaming or slightly broken. Now, to clarify, King Egbert wasn't unaware, simply unapparent. People tended to forget he was in the room, even when he stood on a podium, cleared his throat, and accidentally dropped his hat with a noise not unlike a yawn wrapped in fabric. Yet, oddly enough, this lent him a strange sort of power. He could listen in on ministers without being noticed, drift through policy meetings like a drowsy tumbleweed, and once snoozed during a summit, only to awaken and mutter, "More lemon," which somehow averted a brewing trade war, no pun intended. And so it is that we come to the great teacup incident of 1727. It was not, strictly speaking, great. In fact, it barely made it into the castle Daily Register, tucked between Jenkins, knit another beige sock, and rain again. But in the kingdom of Bumbashire, where beige ruled, sameness reigned, and excitement was treated like a mouse infestation. Quietly discouraged, the incident was tempestuous by local standards. What happened, you ask? Eyes growing heavier, perhaps half-lidded beneath the weight of cozy curiosity. Well, a visiting ambassador from the Tea Confederacy of North Swillingdon, a minor, leaf-worshipping principality to the east, came bearing the finest Darjeeling blend known to mortals. Wrapped in velvet and optimism, it was presented during a formal ceremony involving 12 bows and a faint ceremonial sneeze. King Egbert, naturally, accepted it with all the enthusiasm of damp toast and declared it noted. Then came the fateful moment. Lady Mildred, Duchess of Forgettable Things, brewed the first cup in what appeared to be her favourite chamber pot. No one had the heart to explain this to the ambassador, who watched in utterly silent horror as the tea steeped in porcelain better known for other imports. But King Egbert, in an unprecedented peak of interest, took one thoughtful sip, smacked his lips louder than decorum, and said, "Earthy." Now, this word, earthy, resonated. The ambassador assumed erroneously that this must be a traditional Bumbusher term for supreme approval. The court, mortified by the mix-up, nodded frantically, and within a fortnight, a full-scale alliance was drafted based entirely upon that misinterpreted adjective. Thus, the Treaty of Slight Muddy Aftertaste was signed, with great fanfare and very little actual understanding, ensuring a fruitful leaf-based partnership for the next 3 decades. Scholars would later argue whether the alliance contributed anything of real value. The North Swillingdon tea imports helped slightly reduce yawns in Parliament, while Bumbusher's exports of beige napkins went largely unnoticed, even by those using them. Still, both sides reported historic levels of polite satisfaction, the highest compliment in their respectively sleepy cultures. Back at the palace, King Egbert resumed his primary diplomatic posture, firmly lukewarm. He believed that peace, like tea, should be brewed slowly, stirred gently, and served just at the edge of waking. And perhaps he was right. After all, no wars were declared that decade. Trade remained steadfast in its mediocrity, and most importantly, teacups were no longer mistaken for chamber pots. Well, not officially. The rainy season deepened its hold on the cobblestones outside, the kind of persistent drizzle that slurred time and made days feel like long grey yawn songs. Egbert, wrapped in a cardigan best described as conflicted oatmeal, looked once again to the doily-cushioned teacup. It sat there, unmoving, steaming faintly like a very quiet ghost. He sighed in contentment, pulled a napkin over his knees, and resumed the silent art of royal waiting. For what? He never said. Perhaps the next polite catastrophe, or better yet, a second biscuit. Outside, the bells of Bumbusher chimed a note so neutral it nearly cancelled itself out, and quietly, invisibly, something else was brewing, far in the east, where carts were being stacked high with scrolls, bookworms were sharpening their spectacles, and one theoretical philosopher had just coined the phrase, "a most outrageous footnote." But that's another kind of boredom altogether, one that we shall wander into when the sun rises just tepid enough. As the drizzle drifted sideways and the castle walls sighed beneath the weight of yet another damp afternoon, His Majesty King Egbert, the unimpressive, sat perched upon his 7th favourite chair, a high-backed lump of old velvet and mild disappointment. It faced precisely north-northwest, not for any particular reason, but because that's where the servants had once dragged it during a game of castle shuffle, and Egbert never got around to having it moved back. He rather liked it there, as it gave him the perfect view of a stone wall that gently crumbled in the same rhythmic pace as his enthusiasm for governance. Now, to the bustling affairs of a 14th century monarch, or rather, to the notable absence thereof. Whereas some kings galloped around on horses with names like Thunderbone or Fletcherington the Fast, King Egbert's favourite steed was an ageing mule named Gerald, who once trotted for nearly 2 full minutes before realising he'd forgotten how. Egbert never minded. In fact, he delighted in Gerald's serene inertia, declaring him a model of restraint in an age obsessed with motion. However, it was not his lack of administrative aggression or equine speed that earned Egbert his sleepy crown. No, it was his commitment, nay his artistry, in the royal hobby of doing absolutely nothing at all. Every Tuesday, precisely 5 minutes after lunch, Egbert would embark on what he called his royal contemplative circuit. This involved shuffling from one end of the drawing room to the other, staring thoughtfully at things with no intention of forming a decision about them. Once, he spent an hour gazing at a tapestry featuring swans and tax accounting. He claimed afterward it had changed him. No one could tell how. Of course, to the untrained eye, this might seem like laziness, but no. Egbert was, in all sincerity, something of a philosophical pioneer of peaceful inaction. Where others saw the throne as a place for proclamations, battle strategies, or excommunication ceremonies, Egbert viewed it as a padded seat perfect for watching clouds drift across the tiny slice of sky, just visible through the Hall of Mild Curiosities. From this perch, he cultivated his crowning achievement, the art of high-level loitering. Wisdom, he once said to a nearby candelabra, lives in the quiet corners. A moment of silence followed, until the candelabra, lacking both ears and aliveness, failed to reply, an outcome that deeply delighted Egbert. His advisory council, meanwhile, kept waiting for updates, declarations, or at the very least, a vaguely kingly gesture. Instead, they received a charmingly regular series of non-answers. "Shall we issue new laws, Your Majesty?" asked Chancellor Blevins. Egbert blinked slowly. "Or," he said, adjusting a pillow, "we wait to see if the laws issue themselves." That was the kind of leadership philosophy that carved his legacy gently into history, like someone brushing flour on a sleeping tiger. It should be noted that in the great chronicles of royal pastimes, falconry, feasts, fencing, the occasional suspicious duel in a hedge maze, Egbert's brand of activity stood apart. He was not dull exactly. Rather, he was the human embodiment of a lukewarm biscuit, safe, crumbly, and definitely not a threat. And like a biscuit, dipped into the warm tea of memory, his famously inactive reign left behind an oddly comforting taste. Even court musicians took to composing pieces in honour of his lifestyle. The Concerto of the Nearly Still Afternoon, Fugue for Dusty Time, and the famous lute solo in D minor, subtitled Waiting for the Soup to Cool. For peasants, this era was known as the time of unhurried rain, a period during which taxes were collected at the speed of sheep migration, and justice was delivered roughly 6 months after the crime, possibly by accident. "The best revolutions," Egbert once mumbled while watching moss grow up the outer wall, "are the ones that don't happen at all." But not every corner of the kingdom adored such protracted tranquility. Rumours soon began to flicker through the court, curious, rustling things that smelled faintly of action. Somewhere out there, someone had ideas, loud, organised ideas. But for now, Egbert reclined on his 7th favourite chair, sipping lukewarm elderflower cordial and watching a spider rebuild its web for the 3rd time that week. Some might say he wasted his time. Others might call him a poetic sage. But most likely, he was just a man who had mastered the rare and noble art of sitting down and staying there. And just as the rain deepened and the fireplace yawned its orange glow across the chamber, a note arrived, delivered, breathless and damp, by a messenger with wild eyes. Egbert squinted at the seal. Something was stirring, perhaps at last. But that is not for this soft moment. Let's turn the page tomorrow gently to see what change drifts in with the wind. In the 43rd year of King Egbert, the Unremarkable's reign, otherwise known as the year the lettuce plot almost happened, but didn't, the royal palace was abuzz with a level of excitement not witnessed since the Great Spoon reorganization of 1328. Though excitement in this palace was often defined as mild surprise about a slightly different kind of porridge, that year marked the birth of something altogether more curious: the Royal Monotonous Musical Society. You see, boredom doesn't just wither away. It finds new forms, new technologies, and occasionally new instruments. The society began quite accidentally, as many pulse-shudderingly dull institutions do. One grey afternoon, made greyer by a particularly uninspired drizzle that had gone on for 17 consecutive days, a footman named Reginald Thistlewump was dusting the royal cutlery shelf. A solitary tin teaspoon, slightly bent and profoundly uninspiring, slipped from his sleeve and clinked, a most unimpressive clink, onto the stone flagstones of the East Hall. The sound echoed faintly down the corridor. Egbert, who had been napping, with his historical biscuit compendium as a pillow, perked up, not with shock, but with the most minimal recognition of acoustic change. He lifted one eyebrow, then promptly fell asleep again. But the teaspoon had made an impression, not on the king, of course, but on the court composer, a man named Crispin Muse, who had long since abandoned melody in favour of tonal restraint. Crispin's previous triumphs included Symphony in Beige, The Silence of Peas, and Opera for One Oboe and Three Reluctant Sighs. He'd been looking for a breakthrough, a sound so minimal, so exquisitely uninspiring, that the nobles could fall asleep before the first note ended. The arrival of the teaspoon was, to him, divine revelation. The crumb of an idea turned into a full loaf. Within weeks, the Royal Monotonous Musical Society was formed. Its motto: ad somnum per stillitatem, to sleep through stillness. Comprising one slightly dull lyrist, two harmony scholars who largely refused to hum, and a librarian trained in the ancient art of snoozing at 88 beats per minute, the society began rehearsals of its first piece, Teaspoon in F minor, very minor. Rehearsals were slow. Frequently, entire sections of the orchestra would nod off mid-pause. But Egbert, ever a patron of passive pursuits, was pleased. He attended one rehearsal and described it as utterly tolerable. The public debut, held in the Royal Drawing Room, North Wing, the one with the less interesting portraits, was attended by exactly 17 guests, all of whom brought their own seating cushions, blankets, and a polite expectation of mild tedium. At the first shimmering strike of the teaspoon, gently tapped against a linen napkin, several audience members yawned in perfect harmony. By the middle of Act 1, entitled Waiting for Something Unclear, most attendees had slumped into what specialists later classified as an ennui-induced fugue state. It was a triumph. By the end of the performance, 2.5 hours of sporadic spoon tapping, whispered lullaby motifs, and an unexpected pause that lasted 13 minutes and featured no sounds at all. The Royal Snorers Guild named the piece most effectively yawnable score of the decade. Egbert, sitting in his ceremonial chair of soft disinterest and wrapped in his double-layer blanket of meandering muslin, issued the highest praise he could conjure. That was quite something. And then he drifted off into one of his signature royal dozes, mid-blink. In the months that followed, the teaspoon was elevated to semi-sacred status. It was given a velvet-lined box, a personal fluffer to remove undesirable crumbs, and its own ceremonial nap once a week. The king even considered commissioning a sequel, spoon concerto for strings, woodwinds, and occasional shrugging. But the nation's composers begged for mercy. Even monotony, they argued, has its creative limits. Still, Egbert's kingdom would remember that dazzlingly mild night when a teaspoon, falling by chance, became the star of a concert so boring it was beautiful. And as the rain tapped gently on the mossy stone sills of the palace, the world settled further into stillness. Such is the quiet power of a king whose greatest legacy may well include a spoon and a symphony of snores. And in the next room over, something even more gloriously mundane was taking shape. Ah, here we are. The castle is quiet now. The stone corridors, once echoing with the soft clatter of royal shoes and the desperately whispered debates about sheep taxes, are still. Outside, the rain murmurs over the moss-covered arms of forgotten gargoyles, and inside, our most boring king sits at his window, cradling a lukewarm cup of tea. How fitting that history's dullest monarch should close his long chapter with chamomile. King Egbert the Mild, yes, his real nickname, I promise I'm not making this up, was not a villain, not a warlord, not even a particularly efficient administrator. No, Egbert was something rarer, a man born to rule who preferred his garden. When asked by advisers during a minor rebellion in the north whether he'd raise his standard for battle, Egbert reportedly replied, "Not before I raise my scondo." And thus, scones were enjoyed, rebellions fizzled out, and the king remained blissfully boring. Now it's night. In the hush of the royal solar chamber, solar despite being lit only by candlelight, King Egbert completes his diary entry for the day. One line reads, "Cloudy, goose sneezed, delightful." And really, what more need be said? Outside the palace walls, the world turns, slowly, sleepily, as if out of respect for his enduring dullness. The scribes, exhausted from copy editing the royal decree regarding sock embroidery spacing, 2 threads apart, no less, no more, finally lay down their quills. Somewhere in the kitchens, the last sleepy scullion stirs a bubbling pot of turnip stew, humming an off-key lullaby about St. Mildred and her miraculous bean harvest. Even the royal pigeons seem gentler tonight, cooing peacefully atop the tower, where they sometimes deliver tremendously unimportant messages. One famously read, "To Earl Woofer, fresh soap has arrived. Yours in cleanliness, the crown." But while his kingdom murmured with the gentle thrum of drizzle and domesticity, King Egbert had one final task: to polish the royal button collection. Yes. While other kings displayed swords or jewels or the skulls of their enemies, Egbert's prize relics were buttons, round ones, square ones, some shaped like squash. A button from the tunic of a particularly reliable footman was stored in a velvet-lined box labelled "Steady Fellow." Truly, he was a monarch of curious passions. As he leaned back in his stiff but creakless chair, he had banned creaky furniture in the Great Decree of Comfort, year 14th. Egbert sighed contentedly. His was not a reign of fireworks or conquest. No ballads were sung in alehouses about his onion tax reform or the great lantern extinguishing ceremony of Midsummer Eve, held annually to save oil and encourage reflection. But oh, how deeply ordered, how gloriously unexciting it had all been. Even his royal portrait, the large one in the West Wing, showed him not on horseback or beside a map, but seated beside a slightly confused badger, knitting socks. The court painter had wept gentle tears of boredom the entire time. Still, Egbert's stillness had been a balm in a world occasionally too dramatic for its own good. In his court of quiet loyalties and low-decibel pageantry, he cultivated something rare: peace. The kind of peace that smells faintly of old books and freshly waxed wood. The kind of peace that lets old dogs sleep in sunbeams undisturbed. The kind of peace that lets monarchs slip gently into memory, like a boat disappearing into mist. And now, as the rain drums softly on the grey slate rooftops, as goose feathers settle and chimneys sigh, King Egbert the Mild places his polished button cup on the windowsill and closes his eyes. His crown, lined with wool for comfort, rests beside him, not on his head, but as a reminder that power too may be gentle, that a rain needn't blaze across history like a meteor. Sometimes it may simply drip like soft rain on ivy-covered stone. Sleep well, dear listener, just as Egbert surely did that night. For even in the grand halls of history, there is room, precious room, for the quietly forgettable. And oh, how beautifully forgettable he was. Good night, Your Majesty, and good night to you.